In this opening, as I call this subcommittee to order, without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Just as an aside, technology will not defeat our work. So we are gathered here, and I welcome everyone this afternoon to this afternoon's oversight hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America. Before we begin, I would like to remind members that we have established an email address and distribution list to circulate exhibits, motions, or other written materials that members may want to offer as part of our hearing. If you would like to submit materials, please send them to the email address that has been previously distributed to your offices, and we will circulate the materials to members and staff as quickly as possible. I would also ask all members, both those in person and those attending remotely, to mute your microphones when you are not speaking. This will help prevent feedback and other technical issues. You may unmute yourself anytime you seek recognition. I would also remind all members that guidance from the Office of Attending Physician calls for all members to wear masks even when they are speaking. I will now recognize myself for an opening statement and emphasize the importance of this day. Over the course of the last 4 years, every corner of the United States has felt the impact of rise of domestic terrorism. Communities of faith, peaceful protesters, and even the United States Congress itself have been attacked by domestic terrorists. The executive branch has an array of statutory authorities to prevent attacks and bring charges against domestic terrorists, including those that are white supremacists. It is abundantly clear, however, that despite pleas from Congress and the American people, these tools have not been fully utilized nor implemented effectively and with the full force of law and all the available resources. We must focus on our federal government on the goal of eradicating those homegrown threats in communities across the country. Domestic terrorists pose a clear and deadly threat to the well-being of all Americans. During the past 2 years, this committee has examined the federal response to domestic terrorists each time a horrific and tragic white supremacist attack has taken place. As just one sober example, in August of 2019, the shooting spree at a Walmart in El Paso, the home of our colleague, the Honorable Veronica Escobar, left 22 people dead and 24 more wounded, marking the third deadliest act of violence by domestic extremists in more than 50 years. It is certainly troubling that the core of his hatred was based on language and ethnicity. It is so troubling that there have been so many shocking tragedies in recent years, from the deadly rampage at Pittsburgh's Tree of Life Synagogue, religion and immigration issues, to the 2012 white supremacist attack on the Sikh temple in Milwaukee. So sad that I have been on this committee through all of these horrific attacks, and to the brutal murder of 9 worshipers at the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston. Even our most hallowed houses of worship have become targets of violent and hateful domestic terrorists. The funeral for these precious souls was a powerful statement that we would not tolerate that violence, and was taken to another level when President Barack Obama sang the song, Amazing Grace. For all of those who want to equivocate about the nature of this threat or make false comparison, take a moment to pause and reflect on that statistic. Over the last 10 years, 75% of all murders resulting from domestic terrorism have been the result of right-wing extremists. Attempts to equate white supremacy to anarchists, activists, and other groups who are opposed to white nationalism and other domestic terrors ring as hollow today as they did following the alt-right protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. No, there are not good people on both sides. On January 6th, former President Trump directed a group of his followers, which included an array of hate-filled extremists, to attack the Capitol and Congress at a time when we were fulfilling our sacred constitutional duty in certifying electors. Our citizens have repeatedly seen and have been horrified by the images from that day, including police officers being beaten and bloodied, beatings which caused the death and serious lasting injuries. There are no both sides in this debate. We must not be misled by efforts to divert the attention and accountability for these acts of right-wing violence and terror. Any attempt to do so, for instance, says that the real problem is something called Antifa, is irresponsible and belittles the seriousness of the threat of extreme right-wing violence and misidentifies who the perpetrators predominantly are in this community. As the FBI director said unequivocally, white supremacists are the most lethal threat for domestic violence in our country. Among domestic terrorists, white supremacy has no equivalent. I ask all the members of the subcommittee to join me today in denouncing domestic terrorism, including white supremacy, in all forms. I wish we would just take an oath or raise our hands. With this hearing today, this subcommittee comes together again to seek answers to why our federal government has not taken the steps necessary to address the rising specter of right-wing and white nationalist domestic terrorism. At the beginning of the last Congress, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing entitled Hate Crimes and the Rise of White Nationalism. During that hearing, we heard from a diverse panel of witnesses who described both the rise of white nationalism and the shortcomings in the current enforcement regime. What was clear then, and is clear now, is that our current approach is not working. Enough is enough. It is time for the action, and I look forward to hearing from today's panelists on what federal law enforcement must do to swiftly address the rise of domestic terrorism and how Congress can help. I believe that there are well-reasoned and measured steps that we can take, such as passing Representative Brad Snyder's Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act that would focus the federal government's resources on the continuing threats to terrorize and kill Americans. With domestic terrorism, our country has suffered horrendous and repeated attacks on our people and our democracy, attacks not from beyond our borders, but from within. And as well, we saw on January 6th, those attacks have been on those innocent law enforcement officers standing in the gap to protect the citadel of democracy. The wounds are deep, but our resolve is strong. We must not allow this to continue. And as we examine this very important time in our history, we must recognize the importance, the very importance of the work that we have to do. The nature of the domestic terrorist threats against our country must be examined, and let us do so today. As we proceed today, I'd like to offer the words of Abraham Lincoln. The world will little note nor longer remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. The brave men and living and dead have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. It is for us, the living, rather to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus so nobly advanced. In this committee, I hope that we will finish this noble work and that we will not succumb to this kind of violence in America ever again. I yield back at this time. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure for me to serve on this subcommittee on crime, terrorism, and homeland security. And as this is the first hearing, my first hearing as ranking member of this esteemed subcommittee, I want to start out by saying how much I look forward to working with you to combat violent crime, keep our communities safe, and stand by the men and women of law enforcement. Now, when you and I spoke before, I told you I did not intend to show a video, but something in your comments, I think, causes me to want to change my mind. I'll show you in a second. Turning our attention to today's hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism in America, we must approach the subject with open minds and open eyes. We must acknowledge that all domestic terrorism is wrong and must not only be acknowledged, but condemned. This includes domestic terrorism labeled as right-wing or left-wing. I fear that my colleagues on the other side will simply want to focus on right-wing domestic terrorism, and I hope that I am mistaken. However, I suppose that they would first need to admit that left-wing domestic terrorism exists. And just last year, for instance, the chairman of the whole Judiciary Committee called Antifa imaginary. I suppose our witness today, Mr. No, was beaten and continually threatened by adherents to an imaginary group. Antifa laid siege to some of our cities much of last year, and I hope that we can have a thoughtful and balanced discussion about the issue of domestic terrorism. And I remain hopeful that despite the fact that one of our witnesses here today suggested that ISIS bomb a Trump property in Turkey, I cannot decide which is worse, that a retired naval non-commissioned officer made such a suggestion on Twitter, or that it was thought appropriate to invite him here today to discuss domestic terrorism. Ideologies that fuel domestic terrorism exist all along the political spectrum. And in 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, during a Unite the Right rally, James Alex Fields drove his car into counter-protesters, killing Heather Heyer and injuring 28 others. That was evil and unacceptable. And comments made today and other times since that point need to be put into perspective. And with that, let's go with the video if we may, Madam Chair.
Excuse me, to protest, and you had some very bad people in there. You also had people that were...
Madam Chair, I would ask that
on both sides.
just pause that for a second. With the, Madam Chair, with the feedback that I suggest maybe some people don't have their computers on mute. If they have their computers on mute, that should allow for it to proceed without feedback.
You may proceed.
Thank you. Please proceed with the video.
Excuse me, to protest, and you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. Well, no, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now we're going to take down his statue. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history, you're changing culture, and you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits, and with the helmets, and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
So the point is, the previous president, the former President Trump, called out neo-Nazis and white nationalists and said they should be condemned. I think there's no one in this room that would disagree with that statement. Earlier that same year, we saw politically inspired domestic terrorism that actually hit much closer to our home. As Republican members gathered at Eugene Simpson Stadium Park in Alexandria, Virginia to practice for an annual congressional baseball game for charity, James Thompson Hodgkinson's, age 66, fired at least 70 rounds from a handgun and rifle at the congressman, staff, and others at the park. 5 people were injured during the assault, including Republican Whip Steve Scalise, who was in critical condition and underwent multiple surgeries. The Commonwealth Attorney for the City of Alexandria, a Democrat, concluded, quote, "The evidence in this case establishes beyond a reasonable doubt that the suspect, fueled by rage against Republican legislators, decided to commit an act of terrorism," close quote. He was a Bernie Sanders supporter. We also cannot forget the attack that took place in 2012 at the Family Research Council when Floyd Corkins attempted to, quote, "kill as many people as he could," close quote, at the Family Research Council Center in Washington, D.C. According to the sentencing memorandum, he told the FBI he wanted to kill the people in the building and then smear a Chick-fil-A sandwich on their face. He was inspired to attack the FRC because it had been identified on Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map. It was a different set of ideologies that inspired the attacks on West Coast federal buildings than those that inspired an attack on our Capitol. We've seen white and black supremacist groups inspire domestic terrorist events. In 2015 in Charleston, South Carolina, Dylan Ruth, harboring views of white supremacy, took the lives of 9 congregants of the Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. In 2019 in Jersey City, New Jersey, David N. Anderson and Francine Graham shot and killed 3 people at a kosher grocery store in Jersey City, New Jersey. The shooters also wounded 1 customer and 2 police officers. The Jersey City Police Department detective was shot and killed by the assailants at a nearby cemetery just before the grocery store attack. David Anderson and Francine Graham, identified as black Hebrew Israelites, which the Southern Poverty Law Center found that, quote, "the extremist fringe of the Hebrew Israelite movement is black supremacist." It also wrote that the members of those groups, quote, "believe that Jews are devilish imposters and openly condemn whites as evil personified, deserving only death or slavery," close quote. I hope that our hearing and the outcome of today will address all forms of domestic terrorism, no matter which ideology inspires that terrorism. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses, and I would like to add the indictment and sentencing memo from the Family Research Council case to the record, if that's okay.
Without objection, so ordered. Thank you very much, Mr. Biggs. I'm now pleased to recognize the distinguished chairman of the full committee, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, for his opening statement.
I thank Chairwoman Sheila Jackson-Lee for holding this important and timely hearing. Domestic terrorism continues to be a serious and lethal threat to our country, and we must do more to stop it. Much of this threat is driven by racially motivated hate and animus toward religious minorities. Sadly, many domestic terrorist attacks have taken place through mass shootings, such as the 2019 mass shooting at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas, where a gunman targeted Mexican-American shoppers. This mass shooting joins other attacks perpetrated by domestic terrorists, including the attack at a Sikh temple in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, the massacre at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the mass murder at the Tree of Life Synagogue that's already been mentioned among a tragic list of others. Violent extremism also touched the halls of our Capitol on January 6th, resulting in death and destruction. It is clear that the mob that attacked us that terrible day included significant representation from white nationalists, among other hate-filled groups. We must ensure that our law enforcement resources and priorities are properly directed at this dangerous and growing threat. The FBI's annual Hate Crime Statistics Act report found in 2019, the last year that statistics are available, that there were 7,314 hate crimes, up from 7,120 the year before. These numbers, which hardly show the pain and anguish these attacks brought, is sadly near a record high. FBI Director Christopher Wray also testified that 2019 was the deadliest year for domestic extremist violence since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. And senior FBI officials have noted that racially motivated violent extremists are responsible for the majority of lethal attacks and fatalities perpetrated by domestic terrorists since 2000. But to truly understand what is driving this increase in hate crimes and the link to violent extremists, we still need better and more comprehensive data. The FBI should simplify its data reporting, which must include reliable information from all jurisdictions. And this information should be shared with Congress and the American people in a clear format so that we can better focus resources on the domestic terror threats at hand. We also need to ensure that once informed by the proper data, we dedicate resources towards addressing the greatest threats. That is why I support the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act. a bipartisan measure introduced to do just that. This legislation, of which I'm an original co-sponsor, would create offices within the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI to monitor, investigate, and prosecute cases of domestic terrorism. These newly created offices would be required to focus their resources based on the data collected on the most significant threats. Domestic violent extremism is not a new phenomenon, but it has become supercharged in recent years. We have seen a surge in hate-filled extremist groups driven by conspiracy theories based on racism, misogyny, and xenophobia, which has been fueled by success in online recruiting and organizing. When combined with violence, they form a toxic stew that must be met with the resources necessary to address this threat. We must renew and reinforce our efforts against this scourge by marshaling the resources and authorities we already have excuse me, so that we are more effective in this endeavor. I'm particularly interested in hearing the recommendations of our witnesses today about how best we can do that. Madam Chair, I ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record two documents. The first is a letter from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, signed by 156 organizations, expressing their opposition to the expansion of terrorism-related legal authorities. The second letter from the American Civil Liberties Union highlights the perils that expanded terrorism authorities may pose to communities of color.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman for his remarks. It's now my pleasure to recognize the distinguished ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First, let me congratulate Mr. Biggs, our colleague, as the new ranking member on our side, for his work that he'll have in leading here on this important subcommittee. The violence of January 6th was as wrong can be. Every American has the right under the First Amendment to peacefully protest, but political violence of any kind is unacceptable, and all of us must never tolerate it. And we must denounce all forms of domestic terrorism. But to discuss one kind of extremism and look the other way on another, as the Democrats are trying to do today and have been doing for almost a year, is frankly dishonest, and it's wrong. And I think the American people see through it. Republicans have been consistent in denouncing all acts of political violence. Violence that took place on the 6th of January 2021, and violence that took place across our country in major urban areas throughout the summer of last year. Unfortunately, Democrats have not. All last summer, Democrats looked the other way as violent left-wing extremists used legitimate protest about policing concerns as a vehicle to incite riots and reap destruction throughout our country. And while Americans watched their cities burn, some prominent Democrats in Congress downplayed the threat. Worse yet, some encouraged the violence. The current vice president publicly supported the riots last summer, even asking her supporters to contribute money to raise bail funds for violent extremists arrested in the riots. The Democrat chairman of this committee, this very committee, the Judiciary Committee, called Antifa an imaginary thing and Antifa violence a myth that's only spread in Washington, D.C. My guess is one of our witnesses today will have a little different story to talk about the violence of Antifa. Another Democrat called for there to be, quote, unrest in the streets. While there was unrest in the streets, you have a Democrat member of Congress calling for unrest in the streets. Last July, when former Attorney General Mr. Barr urged this committee to condemn mob violence and destruction of federal property, not one single Democrat spoke up. Last September, we wrote the chairman demanding that we convene a hearing on left-wing violent extremism to confirm that it's not a myth. As was claimed, we're still waiting on a response. Antifa and left-wing violence are certainly no myth. In fact, a recent study showed that attacks by left-wing violent extremists have more than doubled from 2019 to 2020. Violence, whether in Washington, D.C., or Portland, Oregon, or any other place in this country, should be condemned. All forms of it, all the time, by both parties. I hope we can have an honest and productive conversation. Madam Chair, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, Mr. Jordan, for his opening remarks. It's now my privilege to welcome all of our distinguished witnesses, and we thank them for their participation. I'll begin by swearing in our witnesses. I ask our witnesses testifying in person to rise, and I will stand with you. And I ask our witnesses testifying remotely to turn on their audio. Make sure I can see your face. Wave your hand. Yeah, I can see you. All right. And raise your right hand while I administer the oath. Witnesses stand or unmute and raise their right hand. Do you swear or affirm, under penalty of perjury, that the testimony you're about to give is true and correct to the best of your knowledge, information, and belief, so help you God?
I do.
I do.
Thank you so very much. The witnesses have responded. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please remain seated. To the members, let me indicate that we're in the midst of 4 votes, and we're going to attempt to hear at least 1 or 2 witnesses. I'm keeping my eye on the calendar, the floor, as I know your staff are. And then we'll recess and try to get back here as quickly as possible. Thank you, Mr. Biggs, for your indulgence and your cooperation. We will now proceed with the witness introductions. Mr. Wade Henderson currently serves as the interim president of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. He previously served as president of the Leadership Conference for more than 20 years. Prior to joining the Leadership Conference, Mr. Henderson was the Washington Bureau Director of the NAACP, Associate Director of the Washington National Office of the ACLU, and Executive Director of the Council on Legal Education Opportunity. Mr. Malcolm W. Nance. Malcolm W. Nance retired from the United States Navy as a Senior Chief Petty Officer. While in uniform, Mr. Nance worked in naval cryptology, where the focus was on counterterrorism, intelligence, and combat operations. Following the September 11 attacks, he served as an intelligence and security contractor in Iraq, Afghanistan, the UAE, and North Africa. He is founder and executive director of the Terror Asymmetrics Project on Strategy, and in 2016, he published 2 books, Defeating ISIS, Who They Are, How They Fight, What They Believe, and the Plot to Hack America. Annie Ngo. Mr. Annie Ngo is a journalist who has written reports for the New York Post, Newsweek, and others. He is the author of Unmasked Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. Michael German is a fellow with the Brennan Center for Justice, Liberty, and National Security Program. He is a former special agent with the FBI. There he conducted undercover operations against white supremacists and far-right militia groups engaged in the manufacture and use of explosives and illegal firearms. In addition to his current role, Mr. German served as an adjunct professor of law, enforcement, and terrorism at the National Defense University. Please note that each of your written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. Accordingly, I ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes. To help you stay within that time, there is a timing light on your table or where you are virtually viewing it from. When the light switches from green to yellow or your clock starts to down the numbers to 2 minutes, 1 minute, you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. When the light turns red, it signals your 5 minutes have expired. Mr. Henderson, welcome. You may begin.
Thank you. Chairperson Jackson Lee, full committee chairman Nadler, Chairperson Biggs, and full committee member Jordan, and members of the committee. Thank you for holding this hearing today on the federal response to domestic terrorism. I'm Wade Henderson, interim president and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, a coalition of more than 200 national organizations working to build an America as good as its ideals. This hearing, in the wake of January 6th attack on the Capitol, is important. Last month's attack, fueled in part by white nationalism and anti-Semitism that has long thrived in our country, horrified us all. But for those of us who represent marginalized people, the violence did not surprise us because sadly it is not new. We are all too familiar with the ways in which white supremacy has long thrived in our country. We also know that for too long, the threat of white nationalist violence has been weaponized, not only by white supremacists, but also by laws and programs that target us rather than protect us. I'd like to offer 4 recommendations today. First, Congress must pass the Domestic Terrorism Prevention Act without any poison pill amendments that would create a new charge and demand that federal agencies show how they are fighting white supremacist violence. Federal law enforcement already has statutes and investigative powers to combat violence fueled by white supremacy, including over 50 terrorism-related crimes and over a dozen other criminal laws. But it has lacked the will to use them, and the DTPA would help address this. Importantly, the bill would not create new domestic terrorism charges or sentence enhancements that would ultimately harm our communities. Our nation's long history of misusing its mechanisms, including the use of COINTELPRO against Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the post-9/11 targeting of Arabs and Muslims, and the FBI's prioritization of Black identity extremists, makes clear that new authority would be used to expand racial profiling, undermine due process, or target political opponents, all in the name of national security. Instead, we should use existing tools to combat white supremacy without enabling new abuses. Second, Congress must identify ways to address and dismantle white supremacy in law enforcement. We know most police officers report for duty every day, determined to honor their mission. But we also know that there are officers who have actively promoted white supremacist groups that incite or use violence. White supremacy infects so many of our institutions, but its impact on policing is especially devastating. It makes us all less safe, including the police. Congress must demand a full accounting of what is being done to address white supremacy in law enforcement. And the White Supremacy in Law Enforcement Information Act is a good first step. Congress and federal agencies must also identify ways to ensure that law enforcement officers who incite racist violence are no longer welcome. Third, Congress must pass legislation and appropriations to enhance the federal response to hate crimes. White nationalist violence and other hate crime terrorizes communities on a daily basis. We also know that we do not have the accurate data necessary to effectively address it. The Jabara-Hire No Hate Act improves data and community-centered responses. But more must be done, including mandatory reporting and implementation of the National Incident-Based Reporting System. Finally, Congress must pass H.R. 40 to study the efficacy of reparations for African Americans and create a U.S. Commission for Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. For over 400 years, subjugation of Black people was a major factor in American economic growth. Yet long after the end of slavery, Black people are still deprived of the benefits of that growth. If we are to address white nationalist violence, we must confront our history, including disinvestment in Black and brown communities, because it still remains with us. Congress must pass H.R. 40 and reckon and account for our history. Reparations are owed, transformation is required. Now is the time to create a shared vision for a country as good as its ideals, where all are valued. To do this, we must reckon with white supremacy that was present at our founding and persists to this day. Thank you for having me here today. I would be happy to take your questions.
Expired. Now we recognize Mr. Malcolm W. Nance for 5 minutes of testimony. Mr. Nance, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and all the members of this committee. 27 years ago, on April 19, 1995, I was a U.S. Navy Cryptologic Intelligence Chief Petty Officer aboard a Los Angeles-class submarine carrying out operations in the Eastern Hemisphere. I was sitting in the radio communication space monitoring a report from our higher headquarters. One item dominated the unclassified significant events. Truck bomb explodes in Oklahoma City, dozens killed. As a specialist in Middle East terror groups, I was convinced that one of our adversaries had infiltrated the American homeland and perpetrated a major act of violence. I was so sure that I bet an entire month's salary. I quickly lost that bet. The terrorists that conceptualized, built, and delivered the 4,500-pound ammonium nitrate and fuel oil bomb at the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building was a decorated U.S. Army veteran named Timothy James McVeigh. He conspired with two others, including his platoon leader, Terry Nichols, to exact revenge against the government for the deaths of the Branch Davidian religious extremists in Waco, Texas. However, there was a larger ideological belief at play. McVeigh was a white supremacist who had self-radicalized. He came to believe that a race war was imminent in the United States. He used the 1978 fictional novel, The Turner Diaries, as a blueprint to ignite a civil war which would lead to a white domination of North America. The Turner Diaries, written by American neo-Nazi William Pierce, describes America as a dystopia where Black and Hispanic crime runs rampant, 800,000 whites are mass arrested, and guns are confiscated. The fictional Errol Turner is a member of the terrorist group called The Order. In that book, a 5,000-pound truck bomb is detonated at the headquarters of the FBI in Washington, D.C., as the go sign for a war to overthrow the system. The system was represented, America was led by the Jews, the news media, Hollywood, and liberal government politicians. The Order carries out reprisal lynchings of liberal whites they call race traitors in, quote, the day of the rope. The book ends when the fictional hero dies in a kamikaze airplane bombing of the Pentagon. Then came real life. McVeigh copied the described bomb and just altered the target. Another white supremacist, Robert Matthews, a close associate of Pierce, formed a terror group of the same name in the 1980s to carry out robberies, assassination, bombings, and fund the network of white supremacist terror groups, terror training camps in the rural U.S. Matthews would later be killed in a shootout with the FBI. There was a long history of anti-government extremism in our nation. That mistrust is often based on myths, conspiracy theories, paranoia, laced with a healthy dose of rebellion nostalgia. Most domestic violent extremists seek to protect and defend rights, not as they are written in the Constitution, but as they wish they had been written. They live in an alternate information space which bends them out of objective reality. Major violent extremist subclasses include the Ku Klux Klan and white heritage groups, neo-Nazi and fascist international groups, Christian identity movement groups, anti-tax extremists, anti-government militia groups, anti-abortion extremists, anti-immigrant macro-nationalists, class of civilization groups, white ethno-accelerationist groups, conspiracy theory-driven DVEs, autocrat political cultist DVEs. The 2008 election of President Barack Obama would be a watershed moment that would start the consolidation of the disparate wings of the domestic violent extremist movements. But the 2016 election of President Donald Trump gave them a tribal chieftain they can all rally behind. Most right-wing extremists have poorly formed cells with limited capacity or knowledge of terrorist operations. However, many veterans of the military could lend in-depth operational planning and improvised explosive skills to any group. These groups may be amateur, but can demonstrate devastating capability if not detected in time. The former president's 2020 defeat has led to a completely new wave of DVE organization and preparedness that could potentially realize their most violent fever dream fantasies as patriotic resistance fighters straight from the movie Red Dawn. If they do not understand there is a national rejection of their behaviors, then they may feel compunction to act on that potential. We could see future attacks that make Oklahoma City bombing pale in comparison. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions, even the silly ones.
Has expired. Members, there are 185 members who have not voted. I'm going to try and get through at least one more witness because we can vote on at least 2 votes. And hopefully the 3rd vote, and we can come back and not have any further interruption. If there's a member that wants to leave for the floor now, please feel free. I'd like to continue now with Mr. No for his 5 minutes. Mr. No, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs, and members of the committee. Being a journalist from Portland, Oregon, I know domestic terrorism well. Since 2016, I've witnessed how violent extremists from Antifa and others have made political violence on the streets of my home city, banal. Local politicians turned a blind eye to the violence because they believed the extremism was a justified response to the surprise election win of Donald Trump. Local fellow journalists did the same in downplaying Antifa's violent extremism. Today, I ask that you don't do the same. From 2016 through 2019, Portland and the surrounding area suffered dozens of violent protests, mass street brawls, and riots that resulted in serious bodily injuries, arson attacks, and property destruction. By 2020, Antifa exploited the anger around the death of George Floyd and others to launch an unprecedented attempted insurrection in Portland. For more than 120 recurring days, Antifa carried out nightly riots targeting federal, county, and private property. They developed a riot apparatus that included streams of funding for accommodation, travel, riot gear, and weapons. This resulted in a murder, hundreds of arson attacks, mass injuries, and mass property destruction. To put that into context for those here today, similar actions that occurred at the Capitol Hill riot on the 6th of January 2021 were repeated every night, months on end in the Pacific Northwest. In Seattle, Antifa and far-left extremists seized 6 blocks of city territory that they said was autonomous. It resulted in 6 shootings and 2 murders over a period of 3 weeks. In July 2020, then DHS Deputy Secretary Ken Cuccinelli reported to Congress at a Senate hearing that at least 277 injuries have been inflicted on about 140 federal agents protecting the Mark O. Hatfield U.S. Courthouse in Portland. With my own eyes, I witnessed black-clad, masked militants setting fires to buildings occupied by people. The Antifa came armed with homemade IEDs, guns, and knives. They blinded their targets with powerful lasers before throwing projectiles like rocks, glass, and frozen water bottles. Some of them even brought electric power tools to cut apart the fencing that was set up to protect the courthouse. Andrew Faulkner, one of the few federal suspects indicted over rioting charges, allegedly possessed pipe bomb components and a machete at the time of his arrest. The following month, a self-described Antifa member hunted down a Trump supporter in downtown, is shot and dead point blank before fleeing out of state and being killed by federal authorities the following week. He left behind a trail of posts on his social media indicating his desire for an armed conflict with the state, which he viewed as fascist. I'm encouraged today to see lawmakers discussing the important subject of domestic terrorism, but I'm concerned that our representatives are increasingly viewing this through a partisan lens. This puts all Americans at risk. Those speaking before and after me can illuminate and educate us on far-right terrorism, a threat extremely well tracked by government agencies, nonprofits, and journalists. Much less understood is the terrorism threat from the far left, particularly Antifa. Far-left terrorism isn't new in the US. It has a long history in the second half of the 20th century, where groups like the Weather Underground, the Black Liberation Army, and the May 19 Communist Organization carried out bombings, robberies, and jailbreaks in the name of anti-racism. Antifa are continuing that legacy today and use the cloak of anti-fascism to shield themselves from criticism and to fool well-meaning people into becoming allies. In September 2020, FBI Director Chris Wray told lawmakers that Antifa is real and that the FBI investigates the threat coming from violent anarchist extremists who identify with Antifa. We should heed his warnings. Domestic terrorism is not partisan. Both the far left and the far right seek to delegitimize and destabilize the republic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Time has expired. Thank you so very much. Mr. Michael German, you're recognized for 5 minutes. And members, there's still more than 143 members waiting to vote that have not yet voted. Mr. German, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Jackson Lee, Ranking Member Biggs. Chair Nadler and Ranking Member Jordan, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify. The failure to prepare for the January 6th attack on the Capitol is an indictment of the counterterrorism intelligence enterprise built since 9/11. The Justice Department prioritized international terrorism investigations, which in practice primarily targeted Muslims, over domestic terrorism investigations, which did not. International terrorism investigations often involve resource-intensive monitoring and infiltration of Muslim American communities to preemptively identify and selectively prosecute individuals who have never committed an act of violence. The federal government's domestic terrorism efforts, on the other hand, investigate and prosecute only a small percentage of the violent acts actually committed by white supremacists and other far-right militants, including violence committed at rallies all across the country over the last 4 years. It's unknown how much this violence has risen because the government's data collected by private groups show that white supremacists and far-right militants kill far more Americans, including law enforcement officers, than any other group the FBI categorizes as domestic terrorists. Fortunately, Congress has already provided federal law enforcement with all the tools needed to properly address white supremacist and far-right militant violence. I used these tools during domestic terrorism undercover operations as an FBI agent in the 1990s, seizing illegal weapons, solving bombings and hate crimes, and preventing acts of violence. They remain effective. The Justice Department records indicate it prosecutes twice as many domestic terrorism cases as international terrorism cases, using just 1/5 the investigative resources. There is no lack of authority. There are 52 federal crimes of terrorism that apply to domestic acts and dozens of civil rights, organized crime, violent crime, and conspiracy statutes that prosecutors regularly use in domestic terrorism cases. The problem is that the Justice Department and the FBI choose not to prioritize the investigation and prosecution of white supremacist and far-right violence as a matter of policy and practice. They do not even collect accurate data regarding such attacks. Instead, the Justice Department and FBI use these terrorism authorities most aggressively against groups that rarely, if ever, commit fatal attacks. Targeting individuals or groups engaged in civil disobedience or property crimes as terrorists wastes resources and diverts investigators' attention. The Trump administration's efforts to brand anti-fascism as a terrorist threat reportedly distracted the FBI from investigations into violence committed by white supremacists and far-right militants. Despite an aggressive push to investigate protesters as terrorists, federal prosecutors failed to link last year's protest arrests to Antifa, according to reports. Given the Justice Department more power without increased authority will lead to further abuse. Congress needs accurate data about how the Justice Department and the FBI utilize their domestic resources, but they have thwarted efforts to obtain this data. The Justice Department redacts docket information when it discloses non-sensitive prosecutive data to the public, making it impossible to cross-check claimed statistical accomplishments against case records. The Brennan Center is suing the Justice Department to obtain these docket numbers in terrorism prosecutions. The FBI also thwarted congressional demands for data regarding its domestic terrorism program. In 2019, Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which required the FBI to produce data by June 2020 that would allow Congress to determine if the FBI was disproportionately investigating groups that committed fewer fatal attacks. The Bureau has not produced it. The FBI also modified its domestic terrorism categories in a manner that could obscure how it uses its counterterrorism resources. Finally, the FBI regularly warns its agents that white supremacists and far-right militants they investigate often have active links to law enforcement. So it isn't surprising that several police officers were among those arrested for breaching the Capitol, and many more remain under investigation. Oath Keeper membership records reportedly included applicants claiming to be Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers, a Secret Service agent, and 2 FBI employees. Yet the Justice Department has no national strategy to protect communities policed by these dangerously compromised law enforcers. The involvement of law enforcement and military in these groups makes them more dangerous. Congress should require the Justice Department to do what it has refused to do thus far: properly prioritize these investigations by producing a comprehensive national strategy to combat white supremacist and far-right militant violence and the infiltration of law enforcement. Failing to do so undermines the rule of law and the nation's security. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
The gentleman's time has expired. Let me thank all the witnesses for their testimony at this time. Members, I will now call for a recess of this committee hearing. Ask that members pay attention to either staff notifications or their own electronic device. We will try to participate in all the votes on the floor unless there's some irregularities that will occur, and then we'll notify that we're returning while the irregularities are played out in the next series of votes that we have to participate in. The hearing is now a recess. Thank you.
Mr. Nance, if you would give us a quick audio check for us.
Hear me now?
Are we ready? I will call back to order the rise of domestic terrorism in America, the Subcommittee of Crime, Terrorism, and Homeland Security. We will now begin to start the questioning, which will allow each member to have 5 minutes for their questioning. And we will proceed under the 5-minute rule, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. I would like to take this opportunity to address the suggestion that the domestic terrorism, extremism during the 1970s that have been recounted in this hearing was more deadly than the current surge of attacks. According to the Anti-Defamation League's Center for Extremism, while the 1995 and the Oklahoma City bombing remains the deadliest year on record since 1970 for domestic extremism, 4 of those other 5 years, deadliest years, have come since 2015. And I think that we have a roll call of those particular incidences. Again, let me indicate that this hearing is interwoven with white racism and white nationalism, the fomenting of white Nazism, which has generated into violence. It includes, of course, the obvious fact of January 6th. And so let me Mr. Dermott, I'm going to come to you for the first question. Let me just, again, show a picture that has a police officer down and surrounded by the terrorists on January 6th. The police officer is down. Let me also show to you one of the many symbols that was utilized on that day. I think all of America knows what this symbol is supposed to suggest. These, of course, were individuals allegedly protesting an election. In the words of Harry Dunn, who recalled the sickening events of January 6th, he indicated that the Trumpist rioters called me the N-word dozens of times. And he said the level of racial abuse that he suffered caused him to break down in tears, but I'm glad that he also said, y'all failed. My question to you, Mr. Durham, is that it was reported that there was sufficient intelligence that the FBI had, and maybe other federal intelligence agencies, that said January 6th was going to be a bad day. But as testimony evidenced in a Senate hearing yesterday, individuals responsible relayed that they never got this kind of intelligence that individuals, insurgents, insurrectionists, people who were intending to do harm, violent harm, were coming to the Capitol to perpetrate a war. My question to you is twofold. Why did that not happen? And as well, why did the racial overtones seem to dumb down the interests of intelligence entities to give that information to the Metro Police, the Capitol Police, and anyone else that needed that to protect this citadel of democracy? If you would provide an answer, please.
Thank you, Chairwoman Jackson-Lee. White supremacist violence, as you acknowledge, is a persistent problem that has been with us for decades. This isn't something new. The problem is the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security and the network of law enforcement intelligence centers that we've built have been focusing on less lethal threats. And they've set up a system that is constantly warning. So it's warning about any potential that might happen somewhere in the future rather than focusing on events that actually occur. And that is where I think it needs to change. They need to focus where there's actual violence, because much of the discussion yesterday was about one particular memo that was talking about something on social media where they didn't need that. Far-right militants attacked the Oregon State Legislature just 2 weeks prior. Two previous events in DC included Proud Boys engaging in violence at those rallies. So even just following the public reporting about these groups, they should have been much better prepared for what was ultimately an event that was planned in plain sight.
Thank you very much. Mr. Nance, given your experience as a leading expert on counterterrorism, how would you describe American law enforcement's response to domestic terrorism as opposed to Islamic terrorism, and certainly, again, woven in with racial epithets and philosophy? Mr. Nance?
You know, this is going on longer than decades. It goes back to the very founding of this country, where people have, you know, used extremism for their own goals. I mean, you know, we had the Shays Rebellion up to the Civil War, and then the Ku Klux Klan. It was often, you know, a good place for ambitious young men to go into. But leading into the era that we're in now, law enforcement has always dragged its feet because the resources were never given to them. The heyday period of the 1980s, when the FBI was breaking up terrorist groups, internal white supremacist groups within the United States, they still missed the Timothy McVeigh bomb plot. It wasn't just because they didn't have all the resources. It was also, as Mr. German said quite accurately, a lack of focus. They need to understand where the threat comes from, identify that threat, and then focus the resources to ensure that everyone in the nation is safe, no matter what the ideology of the terrorists.
My time has expired. For the ranking member, I went over 50 seconds. You have that opportunity, and I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. No, two of the witnesses testifying today did not even mention Antifa in their written testimony, which is shocking, actually, given the amount of violence that Antifa has wrought over the past several years. Mr. No, if we don't talk about Antifa, is Antifa going away?
No, they're not going away. Since the election night, for example, in Oregon, Portland, Oregon, where I'm from, the National Guard was activated by the governor because dozens, or actually more than 100 masked militants marauded through downtown, destroying property. They vandalized a church that provides charity services on Inauguration Day in Portland. to protest the inauguration of Biden. Antifa destroyed the headquarters of the Democrat Party. So this perception that they only attacked things on the right is wrong. They attack anything that they view as American. So that includes democratic institutions, buildings that represent the rule of law, yeah. Okay.
So, and Mr. No, one of your co-panelists has said of Antifa that, quote, though often violent, they do not yet use terrorist tactics or acts, close quote. Based on what you've seen firsthand, do you agree with that statement?
So I think the issue with the lack of understanding of Antifa's violence comes from the fact that there's not a lot of mainstream media coverage of it. A lot of people, lawmakers in DC, will get their media coverage from the New York Times or Washington Post. And sometimes those publications will send parachute journalists into the Pacific Northwest, but by and large, they don't have somebody on the ground every day as the riots were breaking out, let's say in Portland, or when Chaz, the autonomous zone in Seattle. And this is areas where people were bringing with them homemade explosives in their backpacks and distributing them to others to throw at the federal courthouse, bringing in electric tools to cut into the fence so that they could set the building on fire. They did set the exterior on fire multiple times. And it's not just law enforcement that's inside. There's also civilian people who are working as staff who've had to flee for their lives, as they did at the Justice Center. So I think these acts, because they're targeted on facilities that have civilians inside, I think based on my understanding of the laws, these do count as terrorist acts, but they're not being reported as such or perceived as such for political reasons.
And one of your co-panelists has also said that Antifa's organizing principle is to confront the alt-right. Do you agree with that statement, and can you please explain?
That statement in itself is true, but Antifa's, the label of who they call alt-right or fascist applies very broadly. So yes, it will include people who are actually on the far right, but it will also include people who are patriotic, who are holding an American flag that they will also assault and beat. Any and all law enforcement, anybody who defends the institutions of this country, they view as people who are fascistic in one way or another. And if you dive into their ideology, you look at the literature that they disseminate at their protests and riots and when they establish autonomous zones, you'll see that they're calling for the overthrow of the American government. So this whole label of anti-fascist that they're using is just essentially marketing and branding to mask what is a very extremist, radical agenda to destabilize the republic.
Another comment that was tweeted out by one of your co-panelists said, quote, there are no laws defining domestic terrorism in the USA, close quote. Is that correct, Mr. No? Are there no laws defining domestic terrorism in the U.S.?
There are laws on the book. I think the problem right now is that the investigators are being pressured one way or another to pursue things for political reasons. I'm not here to say that there's no threat coming from the far right. That's not my area of expertise. I defer to those who have been giving testimony today. I think, at the beginning, we heard this 75% of the deaths from domestic terrorist attacks have come from the far right. Well, does that mean that the other 25% doesn't deserve attention? I don't think so. It's about keeping all Americans safe, and that includes investigating all extremist ideologies.
Thank you, Mr. Nuth. And I'll yield back, Madam Chair.
I'll recognize Ms. Bass for 5 minutes. We'll come back to Ms. Bass. I'll recognize Ms. Demings for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, the United States has experienced white supremacy and right-wing extremism since its founding. From the rise of the Ku Klux Klan after the end of the Civil War through the insurrection on January 6th. America has consistently experienced acts of domestic terror. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, for recognizing the brave police officers who were fighting to defend our democracy on that day and fighting for us and for our staff, and also recognizing the Black officer who said he was called the N-word so many times that he burst out in tears and asked the question, is this America? Yeah, we saw the attempted overthrow of the government on January 6th, but those were former President Trump's supporters. Aren't we tired? Aren't we as a nation exhausted? Haven't we had enough? Doesn't this issue deserve more than a political debate, a lackluster and half-hearted response? And if my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to keep score, you will lose. This history is young, or this country is young, but its history is ugly and long. The FBI has been collecting statistics on hate crimes since 1930, and Director Wray testified before the Committee on Homeland Security that domestic violent extremists radicalized online are the greatest threat to our homeland. Mr. German, understanding this history and not being in denial and not asking the American people to not believe their lying eyes and lying ears, understanding this history. Has the federal response to right-wing extremism and domestic terrorism, how has it evolved over the years? And if you would please talk about the DOJ's policy of deferring to state and local authorities for the prosecution and prevention.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that question. The FBI and the Justice Department have long deprioritized the investigation and prosecution of white supremacist and far-right violence. And they do this in a number of ways. One of the ways they do it is by breaking it into different program categories. So if a white supremacist murdered somebody, that might be considered a domestic act of terrorism, but it might also be considered a hate crime if the victim was a part of a protected group. Most often the FBI, or actually I don't know most, very often the FBI the Justice Department, not the FBI, prosecutes white supremacists as gang members in their violent crimes program rather than as terrorists. The problem is if they go down into these other categories with hate crimes, the Justice Department has a policy, a written policy of deferring hate crime investigations to state and local law enforcement, even though state and local law enforcement, at times there are 4 states that don't have hate crime laws, and only 14% of police agencies report that hate crimes occur within their jurisdiction. So that deferral goes into a black hole where we're not actually tracking what violence is actually occurring or who is committing it.
Mr. German, thank you so much for that. How convenient. It goes into a black hole for the many people who have been victims of it. Mr. Henderson, we know the role that social media has played in the rise and reach of hateful ideologies, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy. You've called for civil rights audits. Could you please, Mr. Henderson, talk a little bit about those for us?
Thank you, Congresswoman. A civil rights audit is essentially a collection of data and an analysis of how a particular agency or institution has responded to the great challenge of ensuring that laws are equally enforced, particularly with regard to curbing violence. I don't think there is any question that white nationalist violence has been treated with less urgency and more benign than violence that is allegedly attributed to the left. And our country has a great history, which you've cited, which documents the acceptance of white nationalist violence as an ordinary part of our history. The Klan motivated in 1870 the birth of the Department of Justice and a commitment by the Attorney General to respond to Klan-related violence interrupting the implementation of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the Constitution.
Mr. Henderson, I'm sorry, but
150
thank you so much. I am unfortunately out of time. Thank you very much.
No worries. Thank you.
And thank the gentlelady. I now recognize Mr. Chabot for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. No, I'll begin with you. But first, I wanted to express my condemnation and rejection of the unlawful attack on the Capitol building that we saw back on the 6th of January. There's no excuse for it. Those who participated in that disgraceful display should and will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. That's in the process of occurring right now. And I think everybody on my side and on the other side of the aisle agrees with that. However, there are some on the other side who continue to not see that the violence that occurred in our cities across the country over last summer in particular, and is still going on in some cities, is outrageous and is domestic violence and needs to be stopped just as well. We saw property damage, we saw targeting of police, looting, targeting of public officials, targeting of public buildings, just like the Capitol building is a public building. It goes on both sides. It needs to be rejected, and everything, all the resources we have available to us, we need to stop that. And we ought to be doing it in a bipartisan manner, but unfortunately, too often that just doesn't happen around here. Mr. No, would you agree that during the left-wing extremist violence last summer, there were some prominent elected officials, Democrats for the most part, and much of the mainstream media that not only downplayed what was going on, but in many cases were apologists for that violence that we saw on in America's cities, on America's streets last summer? And could you tell us what you observed with your own two eyes with respect to that?
Thank you for the question. Yes, so the violence that occurred in Portland, which I know best, resulted in hundreds of injuries to federal and local law enforcement. And I was shocked to see that the response from the local city council to the mayor and the senators and the governor were to describe those officers as an occupying force, as Trump's Gestapo, as secret police. That type of rhetoric extremely inflamed the situation and brought in and encouraged other well-meaning protesters to come in, which unfortunately those people were then exploited and used as human shields. So at the riots, particularly in July, when rioters in Antifa and other extremist groups were trying to burn down the federal courthouse, they actually had the peaceful protesters up at the front. So the Wall of Moms, Wall of Vets, and Wall of Dads, they put these people at the very front so that law enforcement would be slow or hesitant to use tear gas or crowd control. And then from the back, the rioters had a whole brigade of people using really powerful lasers that can cause permanent eye damage. They would center it on their targets and then throw glass, rocks, concrete, and other projectiles to injure these officers. And the response over and over from the media was to call these protests mostly peaceful, to the point it became a meme. It seemed like they were living in an alternate reality and not witnessing what was happening and not seeing the actual injuries that were occurring. But I think the most egregious acts that were done in the later months as the riots went on in Portland was the targeting of police stations by rioters who set fires to these facilities when police officers were inside doing work and when civilian staff were doing work inside. And again, this did not get the condemnation that it needed. And in fact, people frequently in positions of power were calling these racial justice protests, which was obfuscating what I view as in the words of the Antifa themselves, an agenda for terroristic actions to intimidate the public into following in line for their political agenda.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, my time is about to expire, so rather than going to somebody else, I'll yield back at this time.
The gentleman has yield back. It's my pleasure to yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I want to thank all of you that are here today. Thank you so much to discuss this really important issue. And as your testimony has all noted, there's a relationship between hate crimes and domestic terrorism. And there are many definitions for each of these, and they often overlap. At their core, hate crimes and domestic terrorism are attacks on who we are, where we come from, what we believe, and the democratic values that unite us as Americans. Like many of my colleagues, I come to this discussion with the attack of January 6th, definitely very fresh on my mind. But as we have this hearing today, I'm also thinking of the lives lost at Charleston's Mother Emanuel AME Church and at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. And I'm thinking of the people we lost to the misogynist violence in Isla Vista and Tallahassee, the yoga studio there. Actually, one of my constituents was a person that was murdered. And I'm thinking of Ahmaud Arbery, who was chased and killed and called the N-word 1 year and actually 1 day ago. And I'm thinking about my own son, Jordan, and the world that I couldn't protect him from. And each of these incidents was motivated by hate. Each of these incidents involved taking a life or many lives for that matter, and we can never get those lives back. But what if someone had seen the signs of hate before the tragedy struck and been able to simply do something about it? I will soon be reintroducing the Federal Extremist Protection Order Act, a bill that actually gives families, neighbors, and law enforcement an additional tool to make sure that people who are a danger to themselves or to others do not have access to firearms. And I think it's an important tool in responding to the imminent threats of violence that people are facing every day. But I also want to discuss how we can act much earlier to combat hate and racial ideologies. The Washington Post recently reported on groups that work to de-radicalize people caught up in hateful movements, often with the help of those who were previously de-radicalized themselves. People like Chris Buckley, a Georgia veteran who turned to the Ku Klux Klan while experiencing drug addiction after his tour in Afghanistan. He was helped out of the Klan by another reformed extremist and now works with Parents for Peace to reach those that he describes as coming out of the military with hatred in their heart. Mr. Nance, the Post reported that groups like Parents for Peace and Life After Hate have been overwhelmed by requests from concerned family and friends following the January 6th attack here at the Capitol. What do we know about how people can be de-radicalized and about the programs that we find like these that are helping people?
You know, that's an excellent question. And there are many groups and individuals who are bought into hate and who have found their way out by educating themselves and then by being around groups that have managed to show the way that violence is certainly not the way. We need to expand these groups because oftentimes when you're dealing with ideologically driven groups, you find that the buy-in is so deep and the social networks around them are so steeped in creating a, how do you put it, a culture of fear and shame if they leave these groups, principally fear that they are going to be not just left out, but that they might be hurt, that they might be viewed as, you know, a snitch, and in some instances killed. And the American neo-Nazis were famous for that, you know, threatening death to members who went out. We need to show that our nation as patriotic Americans, we are greater as a collective than any one individual or groups. And it's critical that law enforcement buy into this also. Do you want to have to really spend money doing surveillance on people or using your joint terrorism task force resources when we can start pulling individuals out of these networks and groups and using them as mouthpieces as well to de-radicalize individuals. It worked in the Islamic model in the Middle East. It can work in the United States.
Well, thank you for that answer. And then also very quickly, Mr. German, your testimony calls on the DOJ to create a national strategy to prevent white supremacist and far-right violence. What would you like that plan to include with respect to de-radicalization and preventing people from getting involved with hate groups in the first place?
Gentlelady's time.
I think we have to be very careful to follow the science on this issue, and there isn't a clear connection between ideology and violence. The Justice Department should be focusing on violence and criminality, and there's enough there for them to focus on. It's for the rest of society.
Gentlelady's time has expired. Thank you.
To work on programs of socialization.
Thank you very much. The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Madam Chair, we know on January 6th there were an estimated early on tens of thousands, then 100,000, some say hundreds of thousands. This week, I was told there were estimated 200 that got into the Capitol. Now, as a former prosecutor and law and order judge, I don't care what your party affiliation is or any other matter. If you commit violence, you're unlawfully committing violence, it needs to be punished. That was uncalled for violence at our Capitol. It was outrageous, and the people should be punished. No question about it. One thing that has not been discussed, and we know that most of the people that were there that day were Trump supporters. And we know that most of the people that went into the Capitol were Trump supporters, and they should be punished. They had no business going into the Capitol. But we don't need to completely ignore others that were in the Capitol, as my friends across the aisle seem to be wanting to do. It's reported that, and I'm quoting, the feds allege in a criminal complaint that John Sullivan, was actively participating in encouraging the siege around the Capitol. He helped one of the rioters scale a wall leading up to an entrance of the Capitol, an affidavit alleges. It says, another New York Post, John Sullivan founded Insurgents USA, a protest group for racial justice and police reform, and referred to himself as activist John, filling his Twitter feeds with anti-President Trump rhetoric and posts supporting Black Lives Matter. I'd like to, there's a picture of Mr. Sullivan's website, Insurgents USA, and you see he's identifies with Antifa, I believe. It's hard to see those, but certainly not a Trump supporter. In fact, we've got a video, got two videos I'd like to play very quickly. And not eat up my time trying to get it played. Well, there goes my time.
What's going on, everybody? My name's John Sullivan. I'm from Salt Lake City, Utah. My group is Insurgents USA. We fucking about to burn this shit down. Fuck this shit. Just power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Damn right. We got fucking rip Trump out of that office right over there. Fucking pull him out that shit. Nah, we ain't about fucking waiting until the next election. We about to go get that motherfucker.
Not sounding like a Trump supporter, as this was before his violence and entry to the Capitol. I believe we got one more if it can be played quickly enough.
We did it.
This is him recording this.
Dude, I was trying to tell you. I couldn't say much.
You were right.
You just have to watch my chat.
Yeah, she's saying you were right, because he had obviously planned on getting into the Capitol. He had told her they could get into the Capitol. This was planned in advance, and here they go through the Capitol. So it's kind of hard to sit and listen that all of the problems were white supremacists when we know that last summer, estimated $2 billion, many deaths, many injuries, deaths including David Dorn, that was just simply trying to protect business and stop the looting and the violence there, and he lost his life because of it. Our hearts go out to Officer Sicknick, but let me tell you, Democrats have never come to understand that one of the more insightful things that they do is not only to misrepresent things as they did the Russia hoax, but then turn around and try to silence Republicans or opposing views, get them off the internet. And when you seal up a pressure cooker and continue to taunt it, test it, heat it, it's not going to work out well. I deplore all violence. I condemn all violence. But let's work together toward a peaceful resolution instead of only seeing one side as the other side does. We on this side see there's problems on both sides. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Gomer, and I think all of us collaborate on our opposition to violence. I think we cannot ignore the penetrating white supremacy and white nationalism that has generated violence. Thank you for your remarks. Let me yield now 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean. Recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Thank you so much. And I thank you for convening this important hearing, timely hearing on the rise of domestic terrorism here in America. It is something we simply cannot ignore. We cannot turn a blind eye to. We have to save lives. I'm going to go right to some questions. I thank all of our testifiers today. Mr. German, maybe I could start with you, if you don't mind. In 2018, and some of you have referred to this, my home state of Pennsylvania was rocked by an act of right-wing terrorism when 11 people were murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. The perpetrator of that attack espoused anti-Semitic, anti-immigrant beliefs. It was a shock to that community, to our society, to the whole Commonwealth. But we should not have been surprised. Nearly a third of right-wing attacks since 2007 have targeted religious institutions, most of them Jewish or Muslim. Mr. German, in your testimony, you highlighted the threat that right-wing extremism poses to religious, ethnic, and other minority groups. In fact, you pointed out that our nation's domestic terrorism policy was founded to address the white supremacist Ku Klux Klan. With that context in mind, can you tell us what role does anti-Semitism play in domestic terrorist ideology, recruiting, and violence?
Thank you very much for the question. In my experience working undercover in these groups, anti-Semitism is a primary driver. Often they use bias against other groups as a way to grow their organization, particularly post 9/11, and using the bias against Muslim Americans was a way that they could grow their organization, as even our military and law enforcement were being trained with Islamophobic training materials, counterterrorism training materials, and the nativism that also comes out of it. So, we saw many groups, militia groups, pivot to this idea of being a border militia and somehow working in tandem with law enforcement at the border rather than antagonistic to law enforcement as they obviously are.
Thank you for that answer. And we know that anti-Semitism, for example, or anti-Islam is not native just to our country. We know that other countries in Europe, for example, struggle with this as well, historically have struggled with it. But do American right-wing extremists draw from anti-Semitic groups in Europe? Are they in any kind of coordination or borrowing or learning worst practices or worst notions?
Absolutely. The FBI sometimes, even just using the language domestic terrorism when they talk about white supremacy is a way of deprioritizing it. White supremacy has always been an international ideology. Ideology respects national borders. So there has always been collaboration with groups in Europe and across Canada, other foreign countries. It's always been part of what these groups have been doing.
Thank you for your work and your testimony. Mr. Nance, if I could pivot to you, again, thank you for your input and your work. From the racist attack at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston to the storming of the Capitol by an insurrectionist mob, a theme has persisted in right-wing terrorism in America, and that theme is guns as the weapon of choice. There is no surprise, given the language emanating from the NRA, quote, "Our founding fathers understood that the guys with the guns make the rules," end quote, or even from former President Trump, quote, "If you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore." Can you tell us what is the relationship between gun rights extremism, not normal gun rights under the Second Amendment, but gun rights extremism and right-wing anti-government extremists in the United States?
You know, the entire myth of the Second Amendment being a tool to overthrow a government that's violent, a government that's oppressive, that is a relatively new thing that was created by the NRA in the 1970s. And I know I was a member of the NRA. I'm a gun collector, and I remember quite clearly when they went crazy with every mailing showing that you needed more guns to protect yourself from the government. It was black helicopter stuff. That is pervasive and it is dangerous because, as ISIS and Al-Qaeda have admitted, the easiest thing you can do in the United States to carry out a terrorist act is get a gun. That does not prohibit Americans who are carrying them lawfully and using them professionally, but it is a notional point that we need to understand. That's what the preferred weapon system of these terrorists and extremists.
I thank you, and I see my time has expired. Thank you so much, Chairman, and to all our testifiers.
I thank the gentlelady for yielding back and acknowledging her time. I'd now like to yield to the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Tiffany.
Thank you, Madam.
5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, I denounce all extremism, and I started doing that years ago, but in particular when it happened in Wisconsin with the State Street riots in Madison, and then went on to Kenosha. I denounced that all the way back in June, as well as the January 6th riots. And I would just ask, Madam Chair, last summer, did you denounce the extremism that was going on in our cities across America?
Is the gentleman posing a question, and I'd be happy to use up his time to respond.
So,
and thank the gentleman.
You mentioned Milwaukee in your statement. As far as I know, a black man who was shot in cold blood, execution style, they have still not found out who the killer is. That black man, Burnell Trammell, was a Trump supporter, wore a Trump shirt every day out on the streets, gunned down, execution style. That's the kind of extremism that is going on in our country. And I'm so glad the chairwoman brings up President Lincoln, because President Lincoln was the first Republican president. And what he believed in was equal justice for all, and that is exactly what we stand for. That's what we stand for, is for equal justice for all. Regardless of your race, creed, or color, if you are going to engage in political violence to harm our country, you should be held to account. Mr. Nance, why did more minorities vote for President Trump in this election?
Our good friend, Mr. Governor.
I'm sorry, is that a legitimate question?
You don't have to answer it if you don't want to. There were more minorities that voted for President Trump in this election. Mr. German.
Are we stipulating that as a fact? Because I'm not quite sure that's a fact. It should count.
We will stipulate that. Mr. German, the man in that video, John Sullivan, He was paid $35,000 by both CNN and NBC for his footage of the Capitol riots. Do you think that that's a good thing for the peace of our nation? When someone, you saw his words, you saw his actions in the Capitol, two major networks paid him $35,000 each. Is that a wise thing for them to be doing?
Thank you for the question, and I don't know the factual circumstance you're talking about, so it's difficult for me to reply in any thoughtful way. Sorry.
No, thank you, Mr. German. So CNN and NBC paid him $35,000. You think the money's being funneled to Insurgents USA? Two major networks, supposed to be respectable in our country, paying a rioter $35,000. So I really appreciate that Mr. Nance, Mr. German, and including the gentle lady from Florida brought up the FBI. You've said they lack focus, they have the tools. The gentle lady from Florida said it's a black hole. Maybe if the FBI spent their time and money on these things that you're all talking about, and I have great respect for what you're all saying, that these dollars that are precious of the taxpayers of the United States of America that are going to the FBI should be spent in an appropriate manner. Instead, they followed the myth of the Russia collusion. Shouldn't James Comey, Andrew McCabe, and others be held accountable for all the time and effort that they spent chasing the Russia collusion, which, by the way, Mr. Mueller showed that there was nothing chargeable there or anything like that? Maybe if they spent the money in an appropriate